My name is Ethan Rodriguez, and before you watch this video, I need to tell you something. This was not the video I planned to record. When I turned this camera on for the first time, my goal was to expose Charlie Kirk, destroy his arguments, and show the world that he was nothing more than another manipulative conservative. I went to the Turning Point USA event prepared to confront, to humiliate, to win. But the moment I grabbed the microphone that night, everything changed. The debate did not just break apart my certainties. It tore off the masks I had built myself. It ripped through my pride, confronted my wounds, and without me even noticing, opened the door that would pull me out of the world of crime I had been trapped in for years. And if you think you know where this story ends, or you don't, because not even I knew. Before I tell you how all of this happened, just check if you're already subscribed, if you left your like and comment your city or country. I want to know how far this story has reached. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, in a place where life always seemed divided between light and shadow. I remember my mother holding my hand as she took me to the small neighborhood church, where the pastor spoke about hope as if it were something as simple as breathing. She always repeated that God could turn any pain into strength. And back then, I believed her. I believed in the humble faith she carried in her eyes. But all we had to do was cross 2 blocks for that faith to feel far away. The neighborhood changed in color, in tone, in scent. It was as if there were 2 cities in one, the home where my mother held a worn-out Bible, and the streets where the noise of the night always tried to swallow everything. My father disappeared from our lives before I even understood what it meant to be a son. I found out years later that he had been in prison since I was 6 years old. My mother said he had made bad choices, but she never spoke with anger. She said God could restore him. I did not understand. And eventually, I stopped wanting to understand. When you grow up around people who are just trying to survive every day, believing in redemption feels like a distant luxury. And inside me, an idea began to take root. If God could restore my father, why didn't he restore our life? Little by little, the streets began to call me. At 15 years old, I joined Los Vipers, one of the most well-known gangs in the area. Not because I wanted to be a criminal, like many people imagine, but because I was tired of being afraid. Tired of being the quiet boy with a mother who prayed too much and a father who was never there to protect me. When I joined the Vipers, it felt like someone finally saw me. They said I was family. They said I mattered, and at that moment in my life, that was enough for me to give them everything. I remember perfectly the sense of belonging I felt in those first weeks. They treated me like a brother. I thought I was gaining an identity, a name, a story of my own. But when you enter that kind of life, what feels like power is actually just an invisible chain. At 17 years old, I was arrested for the first time for stealing a car. Nothing violent, but enough to stain my record and strengthen the lie that I was already on that path. So now I had to go all the way. It was in that cold cell that night that I decided that church, faith, prayer, all of that was a waste of time. There, owning my own choices, I told myself that believers were weak. And I would not be weak. The final blow came shortly after. My cousin Miguel, who was like a brother to me, died in a street confrontation. I won't go into details, but I remember the closed casket. I remember my aunt fainting from grief. I remember the smell of flowers mixed with the heavy silence of the family. And I remember standing there with clenched fists making a promise I believed was made of iron. I will never be weak again. I will never be that person who believes in God. Today it hurts to admit it. But in that moment I turned God into the enemy, as if he were the one to blame for everything life had taken from us. After that, I dove headfirst into the world I already had one foot in. It didn't take long before I became someone useful to the Vipers. I started with small jobs like delivering packages, running errands, nothing that drew attention. But over time, they gave me bigger roles. I became part of the distribution scheme, carried products, handled street communication. Then came the collections, the pressure, the whispered conversations that always made the air heavier. And then, almost without realizing it, I was doing armed security for gang leaders. I was young, but I had already learned how to hide any sign of fear. That's what they expected from me. Coldness, loyalty, silence. And the deeper I sank into that life, the stronger the strange contempt inside me grew toward people of faith. I saw Christians as naive, as people who invented spiritual excuses to avoid facing the harsh reality of life. When my mother tried to talk to me about Jesus, I turned my back. When someone mentioned church, I changed the subject. And when I saw a preacher on TV, I turned it off. But one day marked that shift in a deeper way. I was in a convenience store and a Christian lady, one of those older women with silver hair and kind eyes, approached me. I don't know what she saw in my face, but she placed her hand on my arm and said, "Son, God still has a plan for you." Today I understand the purity of that moment, but at the time, it hit me like an insult. I responded aggressively, told her to mind her own business, and walked out laughing, as if I had won some sort of battle. I won nothing. I only walked further away from anything that resembled hope. It was around that time that I started consuming anti-Christian debates. I would spend hours watching videos that mocked faith, exposés of biblical contradictions, philosophical conversations that gave me ammunition to defend my new lifestyle. I wanted arguments to justify who I was becoming, and this content gave me that. I began to see religion as a tool for manipulation, and I started to think that religious people needed to be confronted, challenged, exposed. A friend from the gang noticed my interest in debates and sent me videos of a guy named Charlie Kirk. He said, "Brother, check this out. This guy is everything you hate." When I clicked on the first video, my reaction was immediate. Oh, this guy. Another conservative thinking he knows everything. I watched several videos in a row, not because I agreed, but because I wanted to refute him. I thought to myself that if I ever met this guy face to face, I would put him in his place. That's where the obsession began. I spent weeks studying Turning Point USA's arguments, not because I wanted to learn, but because I wanted to destroy them. I took notes, paused videos, researched counter-arguments. The more I studied, the more I believed I could dismantle any Christian who crossed my path. And in my arrogance, I said, "If I find this Charlie, I'll prove that faith is fantasy." It didn't take long for me to find out that they were having an event in Phoenix. When I saw the announcement, it was like something lit up inside me. I bought the ticket right away, and when I finalized the purchase, I said out loud, "I'm going to shut this guy up." And I truly believed it. For weeks, I prepared myself as if I were going to an intellectual war. I wrote a huge speech, full of calculated provocations. I practiced speeches in front of the mirror. I rehearsed gestures. I memorized catchy phrases. I had created in my mind the perfect image of the moment when I would humiliate someone who claimed to be a defender of the Christian faith. And every time I thought about it, I felt a distorted kind of satisfaction. The gang eventually found out about the event, and instead of discouraging me, they encouraged me. For them, exposing these kinds of people was almost a service to the streets. One of the leaders, whom I'll call Rico here, pulled me aside a few days before the trip. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're not going to come back here weakened, are you? Show everyone who you are." I didn't realize it at the time, but that phrase became a psychological prison. It was as if my entire identity was being put to the test, and I needed to win. Not just for myself, but for a whole group that expected me to be the strong guy, the guy who doesn't bend. When the day finally arrived, I was trembling inside. But outwardly I displayed that tough posture I had learned to use as armor. I arrived at the event, sat there almost without blinking, waiting for the right moment to raise my hand and grab the microphone. And when I did, adrenaline took over. I started aggressively. After all, that was the plan. I said that Christians were alienated, that the Bible was full of contradictions, that faith was just a way to keep people trapped in outdated ideas. I wanted to be seen as someone who dominated the debate, but all Charlie had to do was listen to everything and calmly respond. He didn't retaliate at all. He only asked me 3 simple questions, so simple that, at that moment, they exposed exactly what I lacked: foundation, philosophy, coherence, maturity. My mind froze. For the first time, I realized that I knew how to attack, but I didn't know how to sustain it. The audience could have turned against me, but they didn't. On the contrary, some people nodded as if they were listening to me with compassion. That disarmed me even more. And then came the question that changed everything. Charlie looked me in the eye and said, "Are you really looking for answers? Or are you running from something?" It was as if that question had pierced through all the layers of hatred I had built up over the years. I tried to answer. I tried to maintain my composure. But my voice failed me. My words wouldn't come out. My whole body felt exposed. I left there not angry, but with something much worse: shame. And at the same time, a strange curiosity that I couldn't explain. And it was precisely at that point that my life began to change, even though I didn't understand it yet. When I left that event, it felt like the ground was still moving beneath my feet. I drove home as if I were on autopilot, with Charlie's question echoing in my head. Are you searching for answers? Or are you running from something? It was impossible to switch off. It was impossible to ignore. The more I tried to push the thought away, the more it returned like an echo, invading every part of my body. I got home late, but I couldn't sleep. The first thing I did was grab my phone and look for the video of the debate. I needed to watch it again. I needed to understand what had happened to me. When I pressed play, I didn't just see a debate. I saw myself. I saw my burdened expression. I saw the arrogance trying to hold on. I saw a lost boy hiding behind rehearsed phrases. I saw someone who wasn't defending ideas. I was defending wounds. I was defending a trauma I'd carried since childhood. And for the first time, I admitted it to myself. It was as if every word I'd spoken in that auditorium had been a desperate attempt to prove that I didn't need God, because deep down, I was too afraid to believe in Him again. As I rewatched that video, a completely new sensation began to spread through my chest. It was like a physical weight, something that tightened and didn't let the air in properly. Some people call it awareness. Others call it awakening. I only know that it was something I had never felt in that way before. And at that moment, something inside me gave way. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't beautiful. It was silent. But it was real. I realized I had been carrying a lifetime of wounds that I had never allowed to surface. I sat for hours on my bedroom floor with the light off, replaying the same passage over and over, until in a moment I never expected, I opened an old box stored in the closet. Inside were some mementos my mother insisted I keep. Childhood photos, a card I had made for her when I was a child, and a Bible, her Bible, the one she used when we went to church on Sundays. The cover was worn, her name handwritten on the back cover. I ran my finger over the letters as if I could feel her presence there. I don't know why, but I opened that Bible. It wasn't planned. It wasn't because I wanted to be spiritual. It was an impulse. I landed straight on the Gospel of John. When I read the verse that said, "The truth will set you free," I froze. I read it once. I read it again. I read it more slowly, and each word seemed to touch a place I thought had already died inside me. The truth will set you free. Till then, I had spent my whole life running from the truth, inventing versions of myself to survive. But at that moment, for the first time, I asked myself, what if I'm wrong about everything? What if God really exists? What if there is something greater than this life I've built for myself? From that early morning onward, I started doing something I never imagined. I began watching testimonial videos. People talking about life changes, about encounters with God, about being freed from fears, addictions, traumas. At first I watched with suspicion. I thought it was too emotional, too intense, too beautiful to be real. But I kept watching. And I kept watching because for the first time I wanted to understand what that peace was that these people said they had found. Then I moved on to apologetics videos, then to Bible studies, then to debates about the meaning of life. I, the guy who spent years mocking Christians, was now immersing myself in what I had always said I hated. This changed me in a strange way. I started isolating myself from the gang. I stopped answering calls, stopped showing up at meeting points. I spent 2 weeks almost hidden inside my house watching videos, reading passages from the Bible, thinking about who I had become. And at the same time, something told me that this was dangerous. Not because I was being too religious, but because distancing myself from the gang without explanation always raised suspicion. And suspicion, in that world, is almost a death sentence. But even with fear, even knowing that my life could become very complicated, I continued to feel something I had never felt before, a kind of calling, a pull, something that made me want to seek more, to understand more, to get closer to God. And I struggled with that, because part of me wanted to run towards this truth I was discovering, but another part wanted to keep things as they were. I was walking on such a fine line that it seemed any misstep could make me collapse. And that's when the danger surfaced, because the gang realized it. One day as I was arriving home, Rico, the same leader who had encouraged me to confront Charlie, was waiting for me on the sidewalk. He leaned against the car, crossed his arms, and looked at me in a way that sent shivers down my spine. He asked why I had disappeared, why I hadn't shown up anymore, why I had missed some jobs. I tried to make excuses, tried to say I was dealing with personal problems, but he interrupted me and uttered the phrase that froze my blood. "Are you getting soft? Have you become a religious fanatic now?" I laughed, tried to look away, but it was too late. They had already noticed something different, and in that world, any change in behavior is seen as weakness, and weakness is dangerous. The change started to become too obvious. I no longer wanted to extort anyone. I avoided attending meetings. I began refusing to carry weapons. I no longer had the same cold stare, and that for them was a sign that I was breaking down. When you live in an environment where respect is earned through toughness, any sign of conscience is seen as betrayal. They started watching me. They didn't say it directly, but I felt it. They followed me from afar. They checked my schedule. They asked other people where I was. They looked for clues, and with each passing day, I felt stronger that sensation of being pulled in two opposite directions. On one side, the old life that demanded loyalty and required me to remain trapped in that identity that never truly belonged to me. On the other side, this new truth that was blossoming within me, this faith that was beginning to invade spaces I thought were already condemned. It was like walking on a narrow bridge with an abyss on either side. It was during this tension that something happened that I never imagined I would do. I decided to go to church, not because I wanted to become religious, but because I needed to understand what was happening inside me. I needed to breathe. I needed answers. So one Sunday night, without telling anyone, I got in my car and drove to a church on the other side of town, where I was sure no one would see me. When I walked in, I felt something strange. It wasn't that mystical shock some people describe. It was familiarity, as if I had returned to a place I'd known for a long time, even though I'd forgotten. The service was already beginning, and the pastor went up to the pulpit with a Bible in his hand. He began to talk about leaving the old life behind, about carrying wounds, about running from the truth, about hiding behind masks. And I remember thinking, how does this man know exactly what I'm going through? That sermon pierced every layer of self-defense I had built up over the years. I tried to resist. I tried to maintain my composure. I tried to convince myself that I was only there to observe. But it didn't work. In the end, when the pastor made an appeal, I felt something inside me break, something deep, ancient, heavy. It was as if an entire wall, which I had carried since childhood, had cracked all at once. And I cried. I cried in a way I hadn't cried since adolescence. I cried from fear, from regret, from pain, from hope, from everything I never had the courage to admit. I cried because, for the first time, I understood that I was tired of being strong in the wrong way, tired of surviving on the inside while dying on the outside, tired of running from the truth that God was trying to show me. I knelt down, I closed my eyes, and I spoke to God for the first time in many years. It wasn't a beautiful prayer. It wasn't full of perfect words. It was simple. I said, "If you are real, I don't want to run away anymore. I need your help." That night, I surrendered my life to Jesus. And to this day, I feel that moment was like breathing after being trapped underwater for a long time. I felt such a profound liberation that it's difficult to describe. It was as if someone had lifted a ton off my chest. For the first time since childhood, I slept peacefully. A peace I didn't even know existed anymore. But even in that peace, I knew one thing. Accepting Christ didn't erase my past. It didn't erase my mistakes. It didn't erase my choices. And sooner or later, I would be held accountable for them. I felt it. I knew that by taking that step, I was entering a battle far greater than any street fight. That was only the beginning. And part of me was ready, but another part trembled. And that's exactly where things start to get even more intense. Because the real war hadn't even started yet. When I woke up that Monday after my conversion, I thought the feeling of peace I had felt the night before would last forever. But the truth is, when you take a step towards the light, all the darkness surrounding you begins to stir. I felt it the instant my phone vibrated. It was a short, cold, direct message. Mandatory meeting today at 8 p.m. Don't miss it. My heart simply sank. I knew what that meant. I knew that no one was called to a mandatory meeting without a reason. Deep down, I felt that my last few weeks of isolation, my changing heart, my silent refusals, none of that had gone unnoticed. I spent the whole day with the feeling that I was walking towards a point of no return. No matter how much I tried to work, eat, breathe, my mind always returned to the same question: what if this is the end? At 8 o'clock sharp, I arrived at the warehouse where everything was happening. The door was already open, as if they were expecting me. As soon as I entered, I realized the atmosphere was different. It wasn't an ordinary meeting. There was too much silence, too many stares, an empty space in the center, as if the ground had been prepared for something I didn't want to witness. One of the leaders, whom I'd known since I was a teenager, stood up slowly, with that expression that said everything without needing to say anything. He walked up to me, stopped a few inches from my face, and spoke in that low voice that always preceded some problem. So that's it? We call you, you disappear, you're absent, you change, and now you come here acting like a saint? You think nobody noticed? I tried to keep my composure, but he wouldn't even let me speak. He took a step back, crossed his arms, and blurted out, "Ethan, you're betraying us, and you know what happens to those who betray." It hit me like an icy blade. I tried to explain. I tried to say that I just needed some time, that I wasn't involved with anyone. But they wouldn't listen. Another leader, the most aggressive one, stepped forward and said firmly, "Those who leave, pay." And before I could react, it all began. It was fast and, at the same time, slow enough for me to feel every second. I was pushed, held, hit, but even so, something inside me said, "Don't fight back. Don't go back to your old life." And that voice was so strong that even while I was trying to protect my face, I kept repeating it mentally. I will not lose what God has begun in me. I didn't fight back. Not even once. And for them, that was just another sign of weakness. For me, it was the only proof that I had truly changed. When they finally let me fall to the ground, the main leader approached and said, "I'm going to give you a chance. 1. Don't disappear. Don't talk to the police. Don't talk to the church. You have a choice. But think carefully." On the way home, with my face hot, my muscles aching, and my soul trembling, the only thing I could think was, if I ran away now, maybe I could start over. Maybe I could avoid the worst. But at the same time, I felt that God didn't want me to run away. Not like that. Not like a coward. It was as if he were saying, the truth that set you free now demands courage. The next day, when I went to the market to buy some things, I noticed a car was following me. It wasn't paranoia. It was surveillance. They wanted to know if I was going to do something wrong, if I was going to look for someone, if I was going to report them. I knew what that meant. Any misstep could be costly. And the worst part was that, inside me, the struggle was getting heavier and heavier. Part of me wanted to disappear and never look back. But another part knew that this wasn't freedom. It was fear, and I didn't want to live in fear anymore. It was then, that same week, that the police knocked on my door. Not with sirens, not forcefully, cautiously. 2 plainclothes officers asked to speak, in private. They had been investigating the gang for months. They knew of my involvement, and they also knew that something had changed in me. They spoke clearly. "Ethan, you're at a point where there are only 2 paths. Either you sink with them, or you choose to live." I remember exactly the moment they put the plea bargain proposal on the table. It was like standing before an invisible fork in the road, one that had been building inside me for a long time. If I didn't talk, I would remain trapped in a cycle of violence, blackmail, and fear. If I did talk, I would put my life and the lives of my family at risk. I couldn't breathe properly while thinking about it. It felt like everything inside me was being torn apart. The following nights were the worst of my life. There was no peace, no rest. I would spend hours staring at the ceiling, wondering what my mother would say if she were by my side, wondering if God would truly be with me if things fell apart, wondering if that choice would make me a better or worse person. It was a crossroads that no one can decide for you. I feared dying. I feared hurting those I loved. I feared losing everything I was beginning to rebuild. And at the same time, I felt I couldn't hide the truth forever. I did the only thing left to me. I prayed like I had never prayed before. I didn't ask for protection. I didn't ask for revenge. I asked for courage. I asked for discernment. I asked for strength. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew I needed to decide with my heart, not with fear. And in a silent early morning, sitting on the floor of my room with the Bible open, I finally felt peace. Not a peace that said, it will be easy, but a peace that said, I'm with you, even if the path is dark. The next morning, I went back to the police station, and with a trembling voice, I said I was ready to cooperate. I handed over everything I knew. No exaggeration, no lies, no hiding anything. Not because I wanted to destroy anyone, but because I needed to be free. I needed to break that chain that had held me back for years. That decision helped dismantle part of the gang's operation. Not everything, but enough to weaken them. And because of that, my life had to change completely. Within a few weeks, I was placed in a protection program. They changed my location, my name on some records, my address, my job. I left behind everything I once knew. My city, my friends, my routine. It was like dying and being reborn at the same time. Starting over from scratch sounds easy when you talk about it, but when you're actually living it, it's simply terrifying. I was sent to another state, a smaller city where nobody knew who I was or where I came from. It was like living inside a blank page, and at the same time, it was the first time in many years that I breathed without fear. The first thing I did was look for a church. Not to hide, but to strengthen myself. I wanted to be surrounded by people who were trying to live for God. I wanted to learn. I wanted to grow. The community welcomed me as if I were part of the family from day one, without knowing anything about my past. It was there that I began to serve, first cleaning chairs, then helping in the studio that recorded the services, and finally, accompanying young people in at-risk situations. I found myself in those young people. I saw in them the wounded boy I had been, and I knew that God was using my story for something greater than I ever imagined. It was during this time that an unexpected passion was born within me: apologetics. The more I studied, the more I wanted to understand the reason for faith, the logic behind hope, the defense of truth. I began to study theology. I began to delve into the Bible with hunger, with thirst, as if I were recovering lost decades. And without realizing it, I began to be invited to share my testimony in small groups, then in schools, then in churches. Each time I told my story, I felt something different. It wasn't shame, it was purpose. A year later, I received an invitation that blew my mind. An email from the Turning Point USA team. They wanted me to speak at the same event where I had first confronted Charlie Kirk. I read that message about 10 times. My first reaction was fear. The second was disbelief. The third was emotion, an emotion so profound that it reminded me exactly where God had brought me from. I traveled to the event with a mixture of trepidation and gratitude. When I entered the auditorium, I felt my heart race. The lights, the people, the energy, everything reminded me of that day when I had tried to destroy someone's faith. Only now I returned not as an enemy, but as a witness to grace. When I went up on stage and saw Charlie in the front row, looking at me with a slight smile, I felt something I had never felt before: freedom. I told my story, every part of it, in the most honest way possible, and I ended by saying, I came to you to destroy the faith of others, but God used you to restore mine. The auditorium fell silent for a second, and then came one of the greatest reactions I've ever heard. But more than applause, what I felt in that moment was redemption. When I finished speaking at that event, I felt that something inside me had finally found its place, not because everything was resolved, but because, for the first time, I was living the truth with courage. And today, looking at you here in this video, I say with all sincerity, the truth set me free, but the journey is still daily. I still struggle with memories, with scars, with thoughts that try to pull me back. But the difference is that now, I don't fight alone. I look at the camera and say the same thing I say to the young people I mentor. If God rescued someone like me from a life of crime, He can rescue you from any invisible prison. In the end, when I look back on this entire journey, I'm still amazed that God took a wounded, hardened, and completely lost heart and wrote a story I would never have dared to write on my own. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's that no one is too far away, no one is too broken, no one is too forgotten to be reached by grace. The truth set me free, yes, but every day I continue to learn that freedom is a journey, not a destination. I still carry scars, I still have difficult days, but now I have direction. I have hope, I have purpose, and I have Jesus. If this story touched you in any way, I want to ask you something simple but powerful. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like so more people can find this message, and comment below. I love Jesus, so that I know you stayed with me until the end. Get ready. The next chapter of our journey of faith is appearing on the screen. She chose the Bible instead of the Quran. They buried her alive, but Jesus did not remain silent. Click and stay with me. This story isn't over yet.